recording as well. I was looking at Professor Adesina's CV and trying to pick out what to say, and it's so voluminous. It's difficult to choose highlights. I would just say, at least from the version of the CV that I had, he's published at least 13 monographs. It seems we've actually lost him, his connection. I don't know if, so before I continue, and I hope you can correct me. I was trying to pick out highlights from your CV and finding it very difficult because there was so much there. An author of, is it at the time of the CV, I saw 13 books, but I think more were in the pipeline. And most importantly, head of Department of History at the University of Ibadan. And so we're very pleased to welcome Professor Adesina to the Makerere History and Archaeology workshop. As I said before, my name is Edgar Taylor. I'm a lecturer in the department. And this is really, I think, a wonderful presentation because it follows on a presentation from our discussant, my colleague, Dr. Pamela Kanakwa, who presented 2 weeks ago on really on a history, partly of the history of the Department of History at Makerere. And Makerere and Ibadan have been connected historically in the production of historical knowledge and sort of the shaping of the historical profession across East and West Africa, and indeed globally, for at least since the 1960s or 1950s. And so I think there's going to be a lot here for us to think about the connections between Makerere and Ibadan in the study of history. So as you'll see on the screen, Professor Adesina will be presenting Beyond Imperial Eyes, Ibadan School of History and the Crossroads of Knowledge. Before I hand over the floor, I'd just like to a few housekeeping issues. Professor Adesina will have anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour to present. Then Dr. Pamela Kanakwa, a senior lecturer in our department, will be the discussant and have anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes to offer comments and questions. And after Professor Adesina has a chance to respond, the floor will be open to questions from the audience, both online and for any of our colleagues who chose to join in person. Just until then, if you could keep yourselves muted until the question and answer session. And if you have a question, you can put it in the chat and either type it there and I can ask you to unmute and ask the question, or use the raise hand button in the app. With that, I would just like to, it's a real pleasure and honor to hand over the floor to Professor Adesina for the presentation today. You're very welcome, and we're looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edgar. Nice to be here. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First and foremost, let me thank the Department of History and Archaeology at Makerere University for offering this platform for me to exchange ideas. It's really a wonderful day for me. Thank you so much. Before I start, I thank everybody who is already online from different parts of the world. And particularly, I'd like to thank the former Vice Chancellor of the University of Ibadan, Professor Olutayo, fellow of the Academy of Science. The Deputy Vice Chancellor, Research, Innovation and Strategic Partnerships, Professor Oluyemisi Bambushi, Senior Advocate of Nigeria, is also here. And I also thank the Dean of Arts, Professor Olutayo, who is also on ground. I thank my colleagues from the Department of History, my friends and colleagues from all over the world. I thank you very much. Well, it's nice to be able to speak about the Ibadan School of History. We have had several writings on different aspects of that iconic school located in Ibadan, southwestern Nigeria. What I'm about to present is just an aspect of a book project I am working on that details the history of that department, as well as the history of the historiography that actually also germinated from that department. So it's a wonderful thing to be able to tell the stories surrounding that department, as well as those who gave their lives to incubate such a wonderful, wonderful epistemology. And so, what do I mean by Beyond Imperial Eyes? One of the most significant stories that came out of Ibadan, as well as other colonial universities, is about Western hegemony. But beyond that narrative of Western hegemony, we actually noticed on ground, especially with the Ibadan blueprint, that the collaboration as well as the agreements that worked very well among the scholars in Ibadan worked so harmoniously and so productively that they were able to work together on what became known as the African historiography. When you talk about Ibadan or you talk about African historiography, you are likely to hear about DK, Kenneth DK, or Adi Ajayi, but the story is much more than that. And we need to tell the story beyond the hegemonic narrative that we have always been used to. And so as part of the preamble, this work looks at the substantial and substantive contributions of the Ibadan School of History to the development of African historiography. That's common knowledge, although it's no longer circulated in the literature because, well, we have lost several generations who are no longer interested in history. We are also producing generations upon generations without a sense of history. So the story of the Ibadan School of History and the wonderful historiography that it incubated is lost somewhere in the maze. And this story has to be retold so that we will understand what it means to contribute to knowledge, what it means to contribute to global intellectual culture. And Ibadan contributed to global intellectual culture. So we have to look at the hard work and the passion that created the Ibadan School. By whom, for whom, when, where, how. That's very, very significant. So it's a dynamic process that actually involved Africans and non-Africans. People are usually very silent about the activities of the non-Africans, but of course the story will not be complete if we don't talk about the non-Africans who actually also contributed to the development of that school and the African historiography. And so what's the process? What is the blueprint? How did Ibadan manage to break out of what you call the colonial historiography, imperial historiography, to establish its presence in the global firmament? So from 1948, when the Department of History took off as part of the University College London, up till the 1950s, when DK joined, the department taught more of European history to its students. This was because that department was actually not configured as a department to teach African history to African students. Rather, it was configured as an institution to prepare students for the external examinations of the University of London. And so from its humble beginnings as a department where European history and the activities of Europeans in Africa were taught, the department moved in the 1950s toward a major accomplishment of a historiographical tradition that would shape the intellectual world in diverse ways. And one thing you have to say for that historiography is that it influenced the larger world of scholarship, influenced identity, influenced nation building. And of course, it resulted in developing a unique epistemology and philosophy in the annals of historiographical tradition in the developing world. So the question is, how did this happen? And who are the major proponents of the idea that gave rise to this school? Well, for me to be able to position the discussion very well, I'm adopting Crossroads of knowledge as the framework of analysis, although it's a complicated concept depending on the prism from which you consider this, and it's difficult when viewed against diverse values and intense contacts and collaborations. It's easy to say, well, still it's hegemonic, still it's imperialist, simply because some groups of people were involved, others were left out. So the question that arises from this is, how did Ibadan, that has been described as the home of African historiography, develop an accommodationist philosophy? Because that is very critical to what we are talking about. And how, at the end of the day, did this give vitality to African historiography? Well, the rise of the Ibadan School of History was a major response to the consequences of European domination and its overweening epistemology. If you have read several works that talked about Africa now having history until the coming of the Europeans, or that everything about Africa was darkness and darkness was not a subject of history, you understand what I'm talking about. We have taught all this at the introductory classes to our undergraduate students, and so they are aware of what the arguments were. Anyway, this resulted in what became known as African or nationalist historiography. If we are talking about nationalist historiography, of course, there are several ways to define it, but I am going with Tony Falala's definition when he said nationalist historiography created a counter discourse, a rejoinder to what is commonly called the quote unquote Eurocentric perception of Africa. How did Ibadan began to develop a counter discourse to this European perception of Africa? That is what Ibadan has achieved. Yes, several schools flowered in Africa, but Ibadan was at the forefront of what became known as the African or nationalist historiography. And so let's look at the colonial origins of the Ibadan school, because we talk about its colonial origins, or about Western hegemony, about history, the dominant analysis from outside the continent. What were the courses adopted by Ibadan that continued with the imperialist thought that colonialism had actually brought along with the imposition of colonial rule on Africa? Let's quickly run through the courses taught by Ibadan before the coming of Dike. Of course, at the apex, you have British colonial history, then European history, circa 800 to 1500, European history from 1500 to the present day, modern European history from 1500 to the middle of the 18th century, modern European history from the middle of the 18th century to the present day, history of Europe, 1500 to 1750, history of Europe, 1750 to the present day, history of political ideas, and then, of course, English history from the middle of the 15th century to the present day. Then there was a special paper. This was the growth of British Commonwealth. 1880 to 1932. So obviously, Africans were being prepared to understand more of Europe than Africa. This was unacceptable to people like Kennedy, although he trained in Britain, yet he adopted that epistemology and historiography, imperialist historiography, to train, while at the same time with an eye on how to bring Africa into the narrative. He was not satisfied merely getting a degree. He took the degree to begin a crusade. And it was that crusade that he launched from Ibadan. When you look at the heads of departments from 1948, when the department was established, we will see a mixture of Europeans and Africans. The first head of department was C.J. Potter, who talks about, oh, well, they are the ones in charge. Then he was followed by Jean Mellanby, and of course, Evelyn Martin. And then in 1954, Kennedy became the head of the department. So we could actually date the revolution in African historiography from 1954, when Kennedy became the head of the department. But the question we are going to ask is, if Kennedy became the head of the department, and he was there from 1954 to 1960, and he went on with the revolution, he was later followed by other Europeans who became the head of the Ibadan School of History, where that revolution was taking place. Did that mean a throwback to imperialist thought? How could Europeans teach in an African university where the new orientation was how to teach African history to African students? Looking at diverse experiences all over Africa, you begin to see why the Ibadan approach was unique. If you read the work of Jean Vansina, Living with Africa, published in 1994, you will understand what I'm talking about. Because Vansina taught at the University of Kinshasa, and his experiences documented the hostility of African students to him, because the African students were not happy that they were being taught African history by a white Belgian teacher. As far as they were concerned, they needed an African teacher to be able to understand African history and then teach African history to African students. So they were hostile to it. But the Ibadan experience was a little bit different. I have talked to some of the products of that period, whether what happened in Kinshasa was replicated at Ibadan, whether they were also hostile to being taught by the non-African teachers in the department. And the pillars I got was, no, everybody was fine. And so how could DK have worked this into the system where the non-Africans were able to agree to the development of African history within the focus of what DK had pioneered in that department? And so when you look at our heads of department, you will see from DK, you will see HFC Smith, who later became Abdullah Smith. He became the head of department. Then, of course, after GF Adeajayi, you still had AFC Ryder, who also became head of department. Then, of course, you have RS Smith, who also became head of department. And then down the line, 1995 to 1997, we had an American, Larry Denzer, who also became head of the department. And all in the Department of History that prided itself in the development of African historiography. Are we still going to be talking about Western hegemony? Or are we going to talk about cooperation? Are we going to talk about inclusiveness? This is what I'm trying to analyze with this work. And so how did Kenneth Dike launch this philosophy? Even after studying in the UK, the home of the so-called Imperial historiography. Well, Dike completed his PhD thesis at King's College, London in 1950. And that thesis was later published as Trade and Politics in the Niger Delta, 1830 to 1885. With that thesis, he became the first African to go through a professional training in Western historical scholarship. And so the question is, how did this happen that somebody who was trained in the Western historical tradition did a 360-degree turn to begin that revolution in African history? So his doctoral work drew significant attention to the African agency in world history and forever changed the perception of the African peoples as passive participants in their own history. So a reading of Dike's Trade and Politics will show how he was able to put the African right at the center of his own history. So what Dike did was to use oral traditions. Oral traditions have been used by different parts of the world for centuries, so that's not a big deal. But he became the first to get oral traditions accepted as part of a scholarly work for a doctorate degree. With that success, he began the crusade for the wide acceptance of African history and historiography as scientific and viable. So we are beneficiaries of that revolution today, because today African history has been accepted worldwide, and it was in his position as the chair of history that he initiated the changes in the modalities for the study of African history. And here is where that revolution got held. He began to recruit allies. Mark that, allies. He began to recruit allies to that school of thought. That's why Ibadan was there. He recruited both indigenous and foreign scholars to join him in the development of that new historiography. So the strategic thinking and the strategic plan that went into the creation of African historiography got support from both indigenous and foreign scholars. And that's why he has been described as father of modern African historiography. He has also been described as venerable pioneer and inspirer of scientific African historiography. We are going to look at what became that scientific historiography subsequently. His activities in the department in historical scholarship through the African Week made JDYP, the well-known British anthropologist, to describe him as quote unquote Abraham of Nigeria historiography. And of course, because of the activities of J.F. Adeajayi with him and after him, after Dike, the same JDYP described Adeajayi as the Moses of African historiography because of their activities in bringing African history and African historiography to fruition. And of course, Falala has described him as a man with a truckload of ideas to dislodge the predatory hold the colonialists had on Africa. So it had to do with not only the decolonization of the curriculum, but also rolling back colonial mentality The thoughts that went into all this became significant because Africans began to think independently of the way imperialists saw things. And so that's a picture of Kenedike in the head of department office at Ibadan. He was head of department from 1954 to 1960 before he became the principal, the first African principal of the university, and ultimately, when Ibadan became independent of the University of London, he became the first vice chancellor of Ibadan. Ibadan benefited from this because the decolonization of Ibadan also gradually began during his tenure. Things have changed significantly from Dike's period, where the process of decolonization became the mantra of the university, to now when there is a gradual self-recolonization of these and several other universities in Africa. But Dike ensured that Ibadan was put on the world map, and that's very significant. Well, let's look at the Moses. J.F. Adiajayi, who described colonialism as an episode in African history. J.F. Adiajayi was a proponent of the idea of change and continuity in African history. Just because colonialism came, the story, the beginning and the end of African history must not start and end with colonialism. Describe it as just an episode. There were several things that went on to shape African thought, African development, African politics, and these ultimately became very significant in the development of African history at Ibadan. Change and continuity became a significant matter. So for him, nothing was permanent in the ebb and flow of history. Nothing was permanent. You don't like the laws of Medes and Persia, immutable. History does not work that way. You have to look at it from the prism of change and continuity. He was particularly concerned with the impact of European rule in Africa vis-a-vis African agency. He said, although colonialism shook people's confidence in the old gods and the old social order, but he argued that while the activities and impact of Europeans could not be completely ignored, the major political movements were not necessarily inspired by Europe. And for him, the colonial impact, even if you want to focus particularly on colonial rule, as being the determinant of the modern African society or the African state. He said the colonial impact cannot be fully understood or assessed except in the context of African history. So no matter how much you teach European history to Africans, what transpired during colonial rule, how Europe became implicated in African lives, will still have to be understood from the perspective of African history. So he complemented Kenedike in developing that African historiography that Ibadan became well known. And so he was also head of department from 1966 to 1969, and in that position, he also contributed immensely to the development of African historiography. Later, he was taken to the University of Lagos to become vice chancellor. And so, and then, of course, we have to talk about the decolonization of the curriculum that Dike started. What was this all about? Is it just changing the title of the subjects being taught to reflect the new African realities? And of course, new courses and publications. That's what began as part of that revolution. New courses and publications reflective of the African past, the African consciousness, and African realities were floating. For the first time, we began to have courses on Nigerian history, on African history, on a lot of histories that were formerly not floated or taught by the Ibadan School of History. So DK proposed the curriculum changes that drew significant attention to Ibadan from 1954 onwards. He also established what became the voice of the Ibadan School, the Ibadan History Series, a series of publications serving as outlets for a new historiography. So we have the past volumes of the Ibadan History Series. Unfortunately, we have not been able to continue with that, with the new generation of scholars, and we hope one day we'll be able to do that. But DK and his people were able to stamp their thoughts, their arguments, analysis of issues and events on what transpired in Africa in the past. So DK became the editor of the series and edited the first 7 volumes published by Longman's Publishers. The first 2 volumes were J.F. Adeajayi's Christian Missions in Nigeria, 1841 and 1891, and J.D. Umakupa's The Zulu Aftermath. So Umakupa was here when he worked on Zulu Aftermath. And so Ibadan became home for a large number of non-Africans who cooperated with DK on working on African historiography. And then, of course, is it then possible to talk about decolonizing the curriculum and looking at the impact of non-Africans and their influence on the Ibadan School of History? Would then it then be right to talk about the resurgence of Western hegemony? This section explores how Western scholars became involved in the race to decolonize the curriculum. During the question and answers session that followed her presentation entitled History, Nationalism, and Power, Uganda's Experience, on July 20, 2022, I was on ground that day. Pamela Kanakwa, who is incidentally going to review my presentation today, talked at length and glowingly about the role of Roland Oliver as a big crusader of African history from his Makerere days. And then, of course, when you talk about Western hegemony and African history, African historiography, should we be talking about non-Africans playing significant roles in the development of African history and historiography? So she was taken up by Dr. Susan Kiguli, Associate Professor of the School of Languages, Literature, and Communication, who wondered about the patronage and the implications for African history, giving so much kudos to Roland Oliver. But what is relevant for this paper here was Pamela's response about the realities at Makerere. But we can also talk about the realities at Ibadan, realities at Adesina. What were the realities? The realities at Ibadan had to do with the direction provided by Kennedy and the reality of bringing people on board to partner with him to help in the development of African historiography. So this paper takes its cue from there to also talk about the realities at Ibadan. What are the realities? The non-Africans try at any point in time try to roll back the achievements of Dek Kennedy and Adeajayi with their membership of that iconic department or with their headship of that department? Well, as I've said, I can only talk a little bit about this because it's going to be included in that major book on the Ibadan School of History. And as they used to say in Nollywood here, please book your copies in advance. It's going to be a significant contribution to the understanding of those who elevated the Ibadan School of History to the pantheon of historiographical traditions. Well, after having charted the path for the evolution of the Ibadan School, Europeans and Americans still headed the school. Did this amount to new colonialism? That's a significant question. Was it imperialism of sorts? So what I want to do now is to point to a few of those non-Africans who headed the department and their activities, as well as their contributions to the development of African historiography. Okay. So one of the earliest was Abdullah Smith, who was head of department from 1960 to 63. He was actually born as Harry Frederick Charles Smith in England in 1920 and was recruited by Kenneth Dickey to the Ibadan School of History in 1955. He cooperated with Dickey in developing the teaching of African history, and he also headed that department from 1960 to 1963. One significant thing is that those who worked in Ibadan, the non-Africans who worked in Ibadan, were able to carry that Ibadan mantra to other universities. You see, after he headed Ibadan, he was recruited to start the Department of History at Zaria. And so he established the Department of History at the Ahmadu Bello University, Zaria, and supervised many of the pioneer PhD theses, including those of Saad Abubakar and Yusuf Bala Usman. Just like Dickey in Ibadan, he also pioneered the development of archives and documentation centers. So when you go to the north today and you have the Arewa House, it was the work of Abdullah Smith. And of course, the wonderful work he did in Ahmadu Bello University was so significant that ABU began to also rival Ibadan as a school of history. The only difference was that ABU went towards Marxism, became a Marxist school. And from that prism, became the major critic of the Ibadan School of History in the approaches to historical knowledge production. And the criticism became so vociferous that Ibadan also began to take notice of what Abu was saying and also began to change some of the ways that we were doing history. And so Abdullah Smith, you will see later on in the work what Dickey had to say about him. And then from 1969 to 72, you had AFC Rider, who also contributed significantly to the development of the department. And then you have R.S. Smith, whose publications contributed so much to the understanding of Yoruba history. And then, of course, you had Larry Denza, an American, a firm believer in the continued significance of the African in African history and development. Her thoughts and works on African personalities were significant. She has written extensively on African themes, such as the Yellow Day in Ibadan politics and society. She had a biography of Olayebe Akintunde Ighodalo. She co-edited work on money struggles and city life evaluation in Ibadan, other above centers in southern Nigeria, 1996. She published Wallace Johnson and the Sierra Leone labor crisis of 1939. She published Women in African Politics and Yoruba Women in Historiographical Studies, and a host of others. And as the head of department, she set up what became known as the Oral History Information Retrieval and Documentation Unit of the department. She also personally provided the seed grant for the takeoff of that unit. So it's very significant to begin to understand how the department benefited from non-Africans who stood by DK, who came after DK to help establish family, that's historiographical tradition. And so Ibadan's intellectual profile reads more like a nexus of culture. So it's not a situation in which Africans did this in isolation. It was a partnership. Yes, it came from DK, went on with Ajayi, and subsequently these non-Africans became partners in the progress witnessed by the Ibadan School. So they are developed what you would call intellectual and moral solidarity. Intellectual and moral solidarity. This is very significant in the development of that department. And so there was that shift away from hostility to cooperation and rapprochement. Who would have thought that those who wanted that department to be the arrowhead of development of African historiography would still cooperate with non-Africans. So other staff from across the seas threw their weight behind African history. J.D. Omakupa gave support from 1956 when he was also recruited by DK. You will see how DK was moving around the world, tapping people to come to Ibadan, and how he ultimately got them to support the standardization of African historiography. And so Omakupa was very important in this respect. He began lectures on South African history. It's one of the most important courses we still have in the department today. He also devoted a great deal of time to editing all the papers submitted for the papers, and then we have a healthy stream of publications coming from that society. Then, of course, J.B. Webster, who ultimately left Ibadan for Uganda. You could see the movement and how Ibadan was creating relationships all over the continent. The Ibadan idea was moving around the continent. And so J.B. Webster in 1965 published a comprehensive list of materials useful for African history. The reading list followed the organization of African history survey courses at the University of Ibadan. It's a very significant publication. And to the best of my knowledge, we have not built on what he worked on. And yet we are the Africans. You know, so it's not enough to just criticize non-Africans for their hegemonic thought or for not supporting what was going on in Africa. They did significantly, and evidence from Ibadan, the records are there, has shown that they were partners in ensuring the growth and development of African historiography. Even the first head of department, Cyril John Porter, that you will call the colonial imperial pioneer head of department, in a way built up an important personal library on West African history. And this was later given over by his family after his death to the University College Library. So it's a blueprint that helped the Ibadan School of History to achieve the dynamism that we are able to talk about today, because DK and his colleagues gave room for other people to contribute ideas. Unlike now, where things have become so insular that people who graduated from a particular department are the only ones being recruited, and of course, from that incestuous relationship, such departments begin to atrophy. We must allow fresh breath, fresh ideas to come in from different parts of the world. And so let's look at Kennedica's testimonies. I've decided to quote this in extenso so that we see that indeed the non-Africans were partners in the creation and establishment of African history, African historiography. This speech was made by DK in 1980. And he said, and I quote him, "It is a matter for celebration that our history, that our society, that is the Imperial Society of Nigeria, numbers among its membership a galaxy of illustrious historians, men and women whose contribution to the history of Black Africa is indisputably great." And of course, DK is not known to be frivolous. He said what he meant, and he meant what he said. So I continue. It is these scholars who, almost simultaneously with the publication of the journal, developed the Ibadan School of African History and assured the growth and development of our society. In paying tribute to the professional historians, I have not forgotten the scores of our laymen whose publications have enriched our understanding of the African past, and particularly in the area of oral tradition. Nevertheless, I will break my rule and name two people who I am sure many of you will agree deserve special mention. The first is a professional historian, Abdullah Smith, who was, at the time of the foundation of the society and the journal, my deputy in the Department of History. Like everything else he touched or believed in, he threw himself completely into the enterprise. All the administrative chores ended at his desk, and he answered letters by return post. I recall his tireless energy and his prolonged discussions with me on ways and means of making the society a success. Many others helped, but I cannot recall any member more dedicated to our cause than Abdullah Smith. So from DK himself, it became obvious that the help he received from colleagues from across the oceans contributed significantly to the development of the Ibadan School of History. But even then, of course, Ibadan came under pressure from diverse sources. And one of these was at the Ahmadu Bello School. And even Omar Cooper, who had worked with Ibadan, began to, from abroad, criticize Ibadan for the conservative nature of its history. And so Ibadan began also to take on board some of these criticisms and began to also look at its curriculum all over again. And so we have moved with the times, looking at the neglected themes, looking at neglected topics, and so Ibadan is the richer for it today. But now, after Ibadan, there is now a student call for decolonizing the curriculum. And you begin to ask yourself, what happened to the decolonizing of the curriculum and thoughts that went into making the Ibadan School of History? The contemporary phase now talks about decoloniality and how we have to decolonize everything. Well, there has been a consistent rollback of the works and achievements of the Ibadan School, as our universities have now willfully subjected our works and thoughts to Western hegemonic control. So unlike the period of decay, when they were agenda setters, our universities have now also made us to kowtow to Western hegemonic thoughts and control. Many African universities are no longer agenda setters. In fact, they are, getting attuned to what was happening globally and now look more like European universities in their thought processes than African universities. And yet, we have our realities. Our realities that must produce challenging thinking that will help us to solve African problems. But that is no longer the case. So the unfolding vistas of new philosophies of education, promotion guidelines, and what, where, and how to publish have made nonsense of the decolonization of the curriculum and thoughts achieved by Ibadan in the 1950s and the 1960s. The question is, what happened to the decolonization of knowledge of the 1950s and 1960s? We have to continue to ask. There is again a strident call for the decolonization of knowledge. It is now a subject of debates, articles, conferences, workshops, seminars, and frontline publications. Recently, Professor Toyin Falola has just come out with Decolonizing African Knowledge, Autoethnography and African Epistemologies. And of course, we also have a publication from the philosopher Prof Olutayo, who wrote on Against Decolonization. The debate is starting all over. And I am sure Ibadan will also weigh in on this very soon when we ask, why are we bringing up decolonization thesis again? What happened to the decolonization of the 1950s and 60s? How are you going to achieve decolonization when it is the university management and administration and people from other fields who are willfully helping Europe and the West generally to colonize us in our thinking, in our ways of doing things, in our ideas? Now, if you are going to get promotion from many of our universities, you have to publish outside. And now, a journal like the Journal of the Historical Society of Nigeria that helped to set the pace and the agenda for African history and African knowledge is now going to be looked at as a local journal. And so, the decolonization of knowledge that is being canvassed now is also likely to fail if we don't have our compatriots to decolonize their thinking. And history departments all over the continent must rise up to help in this challenge. Because what we are witnessing now is a situation in which the African educational system is engaged in a crisis of self-immolation. And we must borrow a leaf from what Decade did, how it did create partnerships, create knowledge production that will help Africa to understand its own place in the sun, not trying to look for succor in Europe and America. So, by way of conclusion, this work has drawn on lessons learned from partnerships and a range of initiatives that develop through inclusivity in knowledge production. But it was a process developed by Africans and non-Africans, where Africans give leadership. Our universities are now allowing us to give leadership in what we do any longer. What we do must be subjected to the activities of gatekeepers in the West. Because they are the owners of the journal, they are the owners of the grants, they determine what they want, not we want, not what we want. And so, when is the new generation of scholars that will follow on the heels of Kennedy rise from our universities again. So in the days of BK, Africans gave leadership in knowledge production to those earlier considered as an hegemonic race. And so that race became partners with the Ibadan School of History. Thus, while the historiographical tradition was homegrown, the value addition created by scholars from abroad also buoyed the intellectual tradition that became known as the Ibadan School of History. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I know we're all online clapping and appreciative for this very fascinating discussion and review of history from University of Ibadan. I'd like now to hand over the floor to our discussant, Dr. Pamela Kanakwa of the Department of History, Archaeology, and Heritage Studies here at Makerere. Pamela, I don't know if you're able to, if you're using your own lap connection or the one in the smart room, but please go ahead.
Hi, Edgar.
So we're getting an echo.
Hi, Edgar.
Yes, we can hear you now.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. Sorry, I think we're a little muted. Thank you very much, Prof, for this very fascinating paper and the amazing links between Ibadan and Makerere. I mean, there's just there's so much in terms of the developments in the 50s, 60s, and also with even the some of the names cutting across. Webster is there. Webster comes here. And our own students here would talk much about Denun and Omar Cooper, whose work they read a lot. And so it's, I felt like I'm part of the research team because quite a number of these issues that you raise are very, very sort of resonate with my own work. And so I just have a few questions, maybe where I would like to ask for clarifications, and maybe alongside some comments on some of the things that I think you can help to better strengthen. So one of the things is that, yes, you say that the history program at Ibadan was not designed to produce African historians specializing in African history at that time. And I think that truly that was the case with, I mean, if you think about all the three, whether University of Ibadan, Makerere, or even Ghana at Legon, there was something, and this seemed to, the initial idea that this or the university would provide space through which the colonizer would continue to have an upper hand on the colonized or formerly colonized. But it's very interesting, again, the ways in which then the school, the Ibadan School of History, comes in place, and the position that it takes. My sort of little knowledge about the Ibadan School of History has been that this was a very radical kind of school seeking to really break away from the Western hegemonic knowledge systems, if you want. So I would want to hear a little bit more about what it is that enabled or facilitated the establishment of the Ibadan School of History, and just what was unique about it, for the sake of those of us from other parts of the continent who are not very familiar with this. So I want to picture myself maybe as a student or an academic at whatever level back in the 50s, what it would mean or what it meant for one to be part of the Ibadan School of History. And so I'm saying this because, again, I see that okay, sorry, there was an interruption there. So I'm asking this because I see that you have key Nigerian historians, of course, led by Kenneth Dike, who pioneer the teaching and, of course, production of knowledge in the field of African history. And when we compare the case with, Ibadan and Makerere, we see that for Makerere, the initial efforts are actually spearheaded by European historians and not African historians in the 50s. So I would like to to just hear a little bit more about this school. What were the objectives? What guided? What the sort of philosophy that guided the Ibadan School of Thought? And of course, as you rightly point out, Kenneth Dike was very central to the establishment of this school, and you highlight his efforts in promoting African history in different ways. I know that he initially, I think he was very, he was not pleased by the heavily European oriented curriculum, and that drove him to involve himself in the social and economic history at the West African Institute. But then, and he also goes ahead, I think he plays a very significant role in the establishment of the national archives, and does all these other very important things. You've clearly shown us that he plays an important role in the decolonization of the history curriculum. But two things there for me. I would want to hear a little bit more about the curriculum revisions then that Dike puts in place. For example, we have that long list of the European courses that you shared, and I would be curious to know what kind of history Dike actually introduced at Ibadan at that time. And just along that line, I'm also wondering, of course, yes, Dike plays a very important role, but what is it? What are some of these enabling processes that actually allowed Dike to do that? Because there is his education, which was in London, where he gets the PhD, and he comes back home. So what is unique? What are the things that enabled Dike to do what he was able to do that perhaps other African historians who attained, whether PhDs or otherwise at that time, were not able to do? In other words, can we also think about the broader processes, what else is going on in the field of African history, as we acknowledge and applaud Dike for what he did? And so alongside that, for example, there is no doubt you mentioned that he was very significant in bringing oral traditions, sort of, I mean, the acceptance of oral traditions as a valid source of African history. And I don't doubt that. But I think that perhaps we should also locate that in the broader debates of oral traditions and African history that date back to about the 1950s, at least from the readings of Fage and Roland Oliver. So we see that these discussions had begun a little bit earlier. And I wonder if there are ways in which such discussions might have also informed DK, or whether these are things that, ideas that he was able to develop on his own following his PhD. Yes, so there's also the point which you point out how ABU became at some point, I mean the Ahmed Bello University, how at some point it became very critical of the Ibadan School of History. And I would have wanted to hear a little bit more, at what point is this happening? What are the potential sources of this disagreement that, you know, the people at ABU perhaps feel and begin to critique, or to critique the Ibadan school. Yes, and then I like when you showed us again the list of the former heads of department. I saw the Larry Denza's name and I was like, yeah, at least there was a woman. You had the woman head of department. And so yes, Ibadan was very inclusive, I would say, because we see these shifts where you have DK and then you have Smith, and then there's a bit of mixing, and that I thought is very interesting. But I'm just curious. So apart from Larry Denza, who is an American historian, do we have space for women at Ibadan rising to important positions, or does history at Ibadan, like, you know, like the case at Makerere, remain such a masculine space that it's only powerful historians like Larry Denza that are able to get to that position? And I think I'm going to say lastly for now, so that I give us a space to other colleagues to ask questions. I wonder if there are ways in which the Ibadan school was affected or shaped by the national politics in Nigeria. And again, I'm just curious, because I think I'm reading from my own work, where we have sort of intellectual vibrancy in history, and, you know, people coming up and trying to do all sorts of things. And we have historians, not just Ugandans, but we have a collection of Nigerians, we have Europeans, we have Americans coming, Canadian, and all that. But once we have the military coup in Uganda, and, you know, just a period after that, that seemed to mark like a very dark moment, and there is really a decline in knowledge production. But Ibadan seems to have kept, you know, I mean, the Ibadan school seems to have, even in spite of, you know, the political changes in the country and all that, it seems to have stayed on form. So again, so I would like to hear a little bit about the Ibadan school and the national politics. Thank you very much, Prof, again, for the very interesting paper.
Thank you. So, Edgar, how do we proceed? You want me to react to that first?
Yes, so if you'd like to respond to as much of those comments as you'd wish to, and then we can open the floor to questions.
Yes. Well, let me quickly go back to this slide to answer some of your questions and posters. I talked about the Ibadan school influencing not only the larger world of scholarship, but also identity and nation building. So Ibadan was at the forefront of not only nationalist historiography, but also nationalist politics, because they were partners with the nationalist class who were agitating for political decolonization. So that's another partnership that the Ibadan School of History forged, and that was very significant in the development of the nation. And that's why ultimately, after political independence, the history department became co-inheritors of the Nigerian state, because many of them were appointed as ministers, state commissioners, and of course, vice chancellors. And it is still going to be in the books how the successes recorded by Ibadan that led the political class to bring them into politics also led to the virtual collapse of Ibadan, because those hands were taken out of the system into national administration, university administration. And so at the end of the day, we are going to talk. I'm working your questions up from below. The next one has to do with women at Ibadan. Well, at Ibadan, we are the weaker sex, because if you look at the list of heads of department, apart from C.J. Porter, who was the pioneer head of department, the next two in quick succession were women. They were women. They called us to come in. So they provided the way. And then, of course, on our staff list, we also had other women, especially in the 70s and 80s. But of course, we are also victims of immigration. Once they get married, they also move. And then right now we have one woman on ground who also is a very powerful woman, Dr. Mutia Oladejo. She's a mother in the department. So yes, we are happy to recruit more women, but the problem is once they finish with their first degree, they move to other things. And so we have been trying to encourage them. This year alone, we have encouraged 2 or 3 people to get overseas scholarships for PhD in history. But of course, you and I know the story, the end story of that. Once they go, they won't come back. So you cannot blame us for holding on the fort until they come back. So yes, we are happy to recruit others, not only from Nigeria, but from elsewhere. We are open to it. And then of course the Abu School. I said earlier that the Abu School actually started as a Marxist school. And so it began to accuse Ibadan of dealing mainly with the superstructure of society. And if you look at the publications from Ibadan, you will see states and kingdoms, empires, powerful men in history. And so for Abu, that was a wrong way of doing history, because you also have to talk about the building blocks of society, the masses, And so you talk about development, you talk of the contributions of the masses of known names to the development of to historical development, and that the paradigm shift witnessed in knowledge production by the Ahmadu Bello University. And so apart from the fact that we gave them the person who started their department. They started to throw stones at us. Well, we have accepted that. And so, as I've said, we have taken on board some of their criticisms, and we have also used that to change part of our curriculum. One of the things that came from that criticism and part of the reality on ground was the need to include more courses that would teach the younger generation about history and development. And so before he retired, Professor J.F. Adeajayi also created another course, wonderful course, Development, Concepts and Realities in the Third World. And that has also opened up a scholarship in Ibadan. Then the broader debates on oral history, yes, the debates were there. And I've said, I mean, when I was presenting that the use of oral tradition is as old as humanity itself. But where the decay case was different was getting oral tradition accepted as part of the writing of a PhD thesis. That's significant. And so when that was done, that created the path for others to use it now. And so even now when we supervise long distance thesis and projects, we want our students to go out into town, do ethnographic research, interview people, and at the end of the day, of course, we want to also see how you have been able to analyze what you have collected to become a significant source of history. And so you asked also about the long list of European courses. Of course, I've told you because of space and time, I have not listed the African courses because there were many. It's going to appear in the book. And so, as I also said, book your copy in advance. So, but it's going to be reflected in the book. But basically, of course, we had courses on Nigeria history, Africa history, on West Africa history, on economic history of West Africa. These were very significant courses that came about. I will talk more about them in the book. And so, what guided the philosophy? What guided the philosophy? That's very significant because you begin to see how Decay's thought influenced what he did ultimately. And so his enduring contributions to African historiography emerged from the philosophy. And listen very well, to the philosophy, because that undergirded everything he did in Ibadan. And that philosophy that Africans must not only instinctively have faith in their own inheritance, but must also satisfy themselves by scientific inquiry that it exists. So with that philosophy, for him, everything became doable. And that was why he began to interest others, Africans and non-Africans, in how to do scientific inquiry in history. And that succeeded significantly. And so, that's part of what facilitated the Ibadan School of History. And of course, it became the strength of that school. I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those responses. It's been a fascinating discussion, and there's already a queue of questions from the audience. So I'll come to the questions online as I see them, and if anyone from the room would has questions, I don't know if Pamela, if you could just let me know. But I know, and I ask in advance your forgiveness if I mispronounce any names. But I see that Professor Oyeshile has been waiting patiently with his hand raised. I don't know, Professor, if you'd like to unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, I've unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Good afternoon. That's a wonderful presentation from Professor Adesina. It has also opened up a lot of challenges. My question is this: since Ibadan School of History is almost succumbing to recolonization, does the Ibadan School of History still exist? And what contributions can it make to the present African predicament through teaching, research, and development? Thank you.
And
Did you get any questions, sir?
Yes. It's fine.
Okay, thank you.
And I wonder if we could just take maybe 2 or 3 at a time, because I know we have such a large audience and limited time remaining. And first I see there's a question in the chat from Abiola Odejide about the influence of the Ibadan School of History on the secondary school curriculum. This was facilitated by the weekly seminars, which attracted teachers from the local secondary schools. So schools like mine, Yejide Girls Summer Grammar School, opted for the African history option in the West African School Certificate. And there's been another comment by Mansa Pra about how the effect that Dike and Ajayi had on the Ghanaian secondary school curriculum as well. So I think they're asking for maybe reflection on the influence on the secondary school curriculum, not just within Nigeria, but regionally as well. I don't know how, if 3 is too many, we can take one more question and then you can respond and we can do another round.
No, 3 is fine.
Is 3 fine? So the next question I've seen, I don't know if Akanmu Adebayo would like to unmute and ask your question. Orally.
Thank you. I put the question on the chat just in case I don't have the chance to do this. Thank you so much, Professor Adesina, for this wonderful presentation. Your presentation focuses especially on the beginning of a phenomenon, the Ibadan School, and it touches on the society, the creation of the historical society, the journal, the book series, and all the work that they did with conferences, and especially the training of the next generation of scholars who would have similar thoughts and who will carry the torch, so to say. There were timely responses to political issues, to economic challenges in the continent from the Ibadan School, and so on and so forth. But then what makes a school? A school is never perpetual. There are changes as new people come into the fold. So has there been some changes? And are we at the point where we can talk of old Ibadan School and new Ibadan School? And what might be the differences or similarities or continuities and change, like you mentioned earlier in your presentation, from this old and new, if there is? So that's my question.
Thank you. I don't know if we have if you can respond to as much of that as you'd like, and then we'll take another round of questions.
Yes, thank you very much, Saz, for this wonderful question, and thank you and welcome, Professor Emeritus Adegide. Thank you for being in attendance. Well, The first question is from my dean. I'm happy he asked this question because we can then ask him for more money to reposition the department. Since Ibadan is almost succumbing to recolonization, well, I'm going to ask in what sense, in what regard, because we have been resisting recolonization. We are true to the tradition that DK established about not succumbing to colonization, but of course we know things are hard, and that has ultimately made it almost impossible to ventilate what our views and positions are. It's difficult to conduct research unless you are lucky to get funds for research. Very difficult to publish. And so, is it then going to be possible to make any contributions to the African condition as we know it now? Well, many of us in the department have been involved in engaged research. Engaged research in the sense that one way or the other, we have started contributing to policy. We have become public scholars. And then, of course, we contribute to radio and television analysis as public commentators. It might not be as strong as the decade period because it's a new generation out there that is not so much interested in listening to the voices of academics. But I can assure you that the Ibadan school, we as the inheritors of that school and of that great philosophy, we are doing well in ensuring that our voices are also heard in critical places. That's what we can do at this moment, and so the kind of organized focus that we witnessed under DK when the nationalist politics also gave them verve. It's not the same thing now. And of course, there are also so many universities, so many departments of history. And so we are now all trying to find a place in the sun. But Ibadan has continued to finally answer your question, has continued to be the greatest producer of manpower for other Nigerian universities. And that's very critical to teaching, to research, to development. Since Ibadan was created, it has provided the staff, the academic staff for Nigerian universities, whether Nigerians or non-Nigerians. And we have continued to witness the same, because now almost every university in the country has an Ibadan product. So with that, we have continued the legacy of the DKT. Then, of course, from Professor Adesina, we have had good conversation about the influence of Ibadan on secondary curriculum. Of course, its her views will also surface in the book, because the European lady who taught them history insisted that they must learn African history. And so she was also attending the weekly seminars of the Department of History. And what she got from there, she began to use in teaching her secondary school students. So the influences of Ibadan went beyond the university system or even beyond the global stage. There were local contributions such as this. And I thank Professor Adesina for pointing me in that direction. And of course, the Ibadan School of History was at the forefront of creating the Historical Society of Nigeria. And the publication known as the Tariq became exceedingly important for the teachers of the secondary school. And so, yes, the Tariq also died at some point, but the current leadership of the Historical Society of Nigeria has revived it. And you also know that history was yanked from the curriculum for almost 30 years. And so the Historical Society of Nigeria has also helped the government in creating a new curriculum. And I am sure that the Tariq, either the old one or the new one they're working on now, will also help in the production of knowledge. Of course, we know the contributions DK and Ajayi made to secondary school curriculum in West Africa. It's not only in Nigeria and Ghana, in West Africa generally. Their books have been significant in the training of almost everyone who passed through the secondary school from the 1950s. And it's very important. We have been trying to also replace even their books on the curriculum. And I know Professor Rashid Olami, whose recent work has made it to the list, is now the current head of department. He took over as the new head of department on Monday. And so his
So I'm in the office
literature
now.
has now been adopted as one of the very important ones. I'm sure very soon it will begin to rival all the old materials for the curriculum. And so, yes, thank you for saying that. Professor Adebayo, thank you very much. Nice to see you. Let me quickly tell you that Professor Adebayo was my teacher at the undergraduate and postgraduate levels. He even supervised my MA thesis. So I see this as a continuation of the supervision. Thank you very much. So, well, the Ibadan school is never, well, the school is never perfect. And there are changes. And do we have an interface between the old and the new Ibadan school? Well, the interface, the first one is in the name. The Department of History is an iconic department, and the first thing we all try to do is to ensure that the stature of that department is maintained, even though it's very difficult now. While it's difficult because you are asking about changes or continuity. In my inaugural lecture, I talked about parallel hunting. The challenges of that period is different from the challenges of this period. And so what the DK group had to contend with and what they had to achieve was so significant that, of course, their names, their ambitions loomed very large. And so when independence was achieved, the question of Africans having a sense of history or having a history in the past had been resolved. And for people, yes, that question has been resolved. So for the present Ibadan School of History, we diverge in different and diverse directions. Yes, we're still with the vision of the old Ibadan School in mind. We are now people who are standing on the shoulders of the past to ensure that we continue to contribute to historical development. Yes, there is still a connection between the past and the present. You know, the past never goes away. Never goes away. So it's always there, and we have been trying as much as possible. And members of the current Ibadan School of History, we have continued to also engage in research from different perspectives. What is missing is that commonality of vision, of approaches that the DK group had. And now the challenges are different, and so we have gone in different directions. But I can assure you that we are trying our best to keep the flag flying. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I have a list of hands raised. I don't know if Taiwo Dahunsi is still has a question, but I saw their hand raised. And then next in line, I have Kewulere and Dr. Nima Lazer. I hope I'm pronouncing that somewhat understandably. But first, Taiwo, yeah, please go ahead.
Good afternoon.
After.
Yes, good afternoon.
Hello, good afternoon. Good
Yes,
afternoon, Prof.
We can hear you. Yes.
Yeah, we really enjoyed the presentation, sir.
Thank you.
And, God bless you, sir.
Thank you.
We know that Ibadan School of History is being widely acknowledged, especially when it comes to African historiography. And we will see that everybody recognizes the school,
Yes.
even concerning on national issues. And that
Yes.
this one born down on the fact, when we look at the fact that some of the appointments at the state level or the regional level and even at the national level, they appointed lecturers from the University of Ibadan, from the department. You will see,
Yes.
for example, I will give example of Professor Adebowale Atada, late Professor Adebowale Atada. He was being appointed under the military administration in Western region. And he was first appointed as the commissioner for local government and chieftaincy matters. We will see, even the military or government generally, they acknowledge the importance of these people and their knowledge concerning African history. But the question is this, sir, if I may ask. We will see what is the contribution or what is the impact of the state, either Western region or even national government, in developing the School of History when it comes to this African historiography kind of thing, sir.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Kewulere, please.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead, please.
It seems his connection is frozen.
Yes.
Maybe while we wait for his connection to stabilize, if Dr. Nima Lazer would like to.
Okay, yeah. Thank you very much
Oh,
for the
sorry.
presentation to document the African past in oral information. I don't know what we need to do.
Sorry about. It seems we've lost him. Hopefully, we can get that question when he comes back.
Okay.
Yes, Dr. Nima.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for a very nice presentation. I would like to ask a few questions. I'm not from the field of history, but I can well relate to this discussion. And I just have one question. I acknowledge the contributions made by Professors BK, Ajay, and others in deconstructing the European or the Euro-American hegemony in African schools, like the Ibadan school. But I would like to know how African bodies of knowledge production intend to engage the Euro-American colleagues as knowledge co-creators, rather than looking at them as hegemonic and people who impose things upon the African knowledge production. And how can we allow a constant engagement of this nature?
Thank you.
Thank you. And maybe if we could just take one more. I think there's a couple of related questions in the chat about, I guess, relevance or something along those lines. So, well, first, Ganyu Adekunle asks essentially, what are you doing to ensure that that history returns fully to secondary schools in Nigeria? And then there's a question from Abdul Muiz Oyekola, is that recently in the, actually, I don't know if you'd like to unmute and ask the question. It's essentially about where
No, I got it.
Yes.
Abdul Muiz Oyekola, I got it.
Where are the historians in
Yes, I
public
got it.
debate? Yeah. Which I think is something we could ask across any context in the world right now. Where are the historians in public discourse beyond the academy? And then we'll have we have a series of 3 more questions after this round. So
okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. For Dawzi Taiwo, what is the contribution of the state in the development of history, historiography, etc.? Well, the state has tried in the past to interface with the departments of history across the country. We have seen situations where the governments tapped members of the school to be part of the establishment of new universities, historical research schemes. You had the Yoruba research scheme, you had the Benin research scheme, you had the Eastern Nigerian research scheme, which DK participated in significantly. And of course, you must see the role that DK played in the establishment of the Nigerian archives, as well as the Institute of Social and Economic Research. So for a long time, apart from appointing them into positions, they have also supported them in research and publications. History of Nigeria since independence and several other publications were things actually sponsored and funded by either the state, regional, or federal government. So they have done a lot. But with the coming of structural adjustment in 1986, history became one of the endangered subjects. In fact, that's putting it mildly. History became, quote unquote, one of the useless subjects. And so the government did everything to ensure that it became very unpopular. If anything is not scalable, if it doesn't bring money, if it's not a professional course, under the mantra of the structural adjustment and the World Bank and IMF, is not a good subject. So history was taken off the curriculum of secondary schools in Nigeria. And so they forgot that it's not everything that must bring in money. For a course like history, it has to do with, it has a didactic nature, how to teach people about society, teach knowledge, teach values. And so we historians continue to see that part of the Nigerian problem, the Nigerian condition today, is that after the removal of history, we produced about 3 generations of Nigerians without a sense and knowledge of history. So if things are out of control now, it's because the Nigerian state caused it. So we shouted ourselves hoarse, and then of course, we then pointed them in the direction of the wrongs that its removal has wrought on society. So eventually in 2018, the federal government restored history to the curriculum of the secondary school. But it's already very late. 3 generations without a sense of history. Now they have seen the problems. Now history is back on the curriculum, but it's going to take some time to actually take its pride of place as a subject in Nigerian secondary schools, especially now that even this generation is a generation that is on the fast lane. They don't understand why they have to put their heads in the past when there is a bright future in front of them, are doing a lot of things. They don't want to live by the past. So we are going to make that relevant subsequently and make them to understand why they need history as part of that movement towards the future. It's very significant in this regard, or else we are all going to suffer for it subsequently. And then, of course, Moise was talking about the voices of Nigerian historians not being heard like that of political scientists, sociologists. Well, it depends on what you listen to. I know scholars from Ibadan, from Lagos, from LASU, from Osun are constantly on television. They also constantly write. Why you think we are not talking is because we are very few. Unlike political scientists who are many and can throw their weight all over the place, they are also more relevant to government now because as far as they are concerned, they can talk about what is happening on ground. But for historians, they don't think we have a stake in what is happening. But we have been very important as commentators, television programs, radio programs, and newspaper analysis. So it's not true that we are not engaging. We are engaging the public also. And then, of course, for Dr. Nima, deconstructing the Euro-African hegemony by decade group and how we can engage the present world as co-creators. Well, we are trying our best, but you know, he who pays the piper dictates the tune. As long as you don't have the funds, of course, those who fund, the funding agencies, they dictate what they want. It's like the old religious thing, you know, kill regius, kill religio. People follow the religion of their rulers. It's the same way. You follow the dictates of the money people. And so as long as the lions don't have their own historian, the perspective of hunting will always be written from the perspective of the hunter. So the same thing with funding. And so we will become knowledge creators when we also come out strongly. When we have our source of funding, when we have our pride, we can also say no. But now, when our universities are insisting, attract funding, you are not doing this, you are not doing that. It's part of your promotion guideline. Of course, to get promoted, if somebody says, I have money, for you to say, well, the history of Africa has not been doing well, of course you say it. That's for those who are ready to say it because they wanted promotion. So that's part of what we are saying. If our university system is insisting that we must be top of the shelf, they must also provide the funding for us to become agenda setters. When you become an agenda setter, then you become a co-creator of knowledge. But at present, our university systems are too badly funded for us to be able to engage in the kind of cooperation that we witnessed under decade and that you are trying to suggest now. It's in the future, it's going to happen, and we are optimistic that we'll be able to get there. But at present, we don't have that kind of resources and we don't have that strength. We have the ideas, we have the knowledge, but we don't have the resources. Thank you.
Thank you. So I realized that we've, oh, sorry, I didn't know if you had.
Excuse me?
Hello?
Yes.
Hello?
So I do realize for members, thank you for staying with us. We're we officially have reached our time, but with your indulgence, I think we'll continue for one more extended round of questions, just so we can continue this discussion, if you're willing to do that, Professor.
Okay.
So okay. I would just ask if people could ask your questions as briefly as possible, and then
can I ask you a question, Professor?
Yes, please. Remiraj is on the line.
Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Adesina. We're always happy that you continue to, to push the frontiers of Ibadan School of History, at this time. Thank you very much, you and your colleagues in our university. Yeah, so I'm from the English department, and I see some kind of similarity, some kind of burden, the burden of history, both on the Department of English and that of history. Nowadays, our universities are established departments of English, and they do not want to name them Department of English. They call them Departments of English and Literary Studies and such other nomenclature. The same thing goes for history. Most of the departments, after the establishment of UI Ife and Benin, for instance, most of them name their departments as, they always have an appendage. History is not enough. History is just a part of a department that must include international relations. I think there's something about that challenge who write the policymakers now. Why is it not possible to have a Department of History straight and clean? Than to always have an appendage like international relations, diplomatic studies. It is, I don't know if you have a response to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Thank you. Again. And we have a list here. I just maybe add a follow-on to that question, just about, I think the issue from Makerere has been one of the ways of dealing with this sort of assault on the humanities has been to social science eyes, or I don't know what the word is, but to frame history in the language of social science. And we can see now that has had the influence that's had on how graduate students and even ourselves frame the relevance of our work, often in the language of policy recommendations and so on. So I just wonder what your reflections are on, what is the relationship, if I could put it this way, between decolonizing the curriculum and, at one hand, also defending a discipline. Much of the work in decolonization is around breaking down the barriers of disciplines and so on, but often in practice we're doing the opposite. We're trying to defend history from other forces. So I have a list of, I believe, 4 or 5 more questions. I think we'll take those, and then you can offer your concluding remarks and so on. So first, I saw Abdullah where Abdullah Aragun. Sorry, I've just lost the name. I'm trying to find it. Here we go. Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. Good afternoon, Prof.
Good afternoon.
Thank you very much for the lecture. I missed the early part of the lecture, but I was able to catch up.
Yes.
My question has to do with the web presence of Historical Society of Nigeria. What I mean by web presence is yes, the HSN has a website, and often I visit it, and one of those things I think the HSN and maybe they call them Gen Zs and the millennials. One of those things we can begin to look at is making history have a utilitarian value. most times you see graduates or undergraduates now doing topics on maybe sports, popular culture, because it's something they can relate with, even not minding having to do with the past. So my question is, how is HSN and the discipline in general looking into new fields? Because I found out that it's the same thing. The curriculum we've been having over the years are static. Maybe I believe maybe it should, if there will be a way, some of those courses or over the years can be reviewed, and there will be new additions into it. So I want to know how is the HSN or how is the history making that web present, because it's also one of the issues of relevance. If you are going to be talking about relevance, some of those things is having a web presence, and that's my question. It's two-edged. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I see Temitope Fagunwa.
Yes, greetings. Can I be heard?
Yes, please.
Yeah, greetings to our Professor Adesina. Prof, thank you for the presentation. Prof has consistently been an academic father to many of us, and listening to this presentation again reminds us of that consistency that Prof has come up with in terms of raising the academic children of Prof. So, Prof, thanks for the presentation. It is true, Prof, that the current state of the African academy largely is currently in a terrible situation, and the progressive academic scholars have insisted that if there's going to be a change, then there must be the emergence of activist scholars across the African academy. And drawing inspiration from the concluding part of your presentation, Prof, you made reference to the fact that ordinarily the department ought to be involved in the question or in the place of setting up agenda. That's what society should be and what have you. But again, progressive within the African academic arena, I've consistently said that the relevance of any department can only be felt if there is that struggle against the current backward neoliberal state of the academy. So even if we decide to come up with journals or write papers that make references to the necessity of decolonization, to what extent is this whole thing around decolonization possible when the Nigerian state itself, when the African state itself is under the whims and caprices of neoliberalism? Is it in any way possible for us to have a
I think we may have
existing policy inspiration? Hello, can I be heard? Hello.
Yes.
Hello. Okay. Drawing inspiration from the intervention of Professor DK, particularly on having professors, having scholars from all over the world down in the Ibadan School of History. At that material point in time, it was extremely helpful. But Prof, how would you react to the interventions of professors such as Professor Lupusi, the argument around the fact that the African academy itself, the field of African studies, have got to be strengthened. The folds of African studies have got to be strengthened by African scholars themselves, in the sense of what needed to be done, in the sense of the reconstruction, the decolonization of African history itself have got to be the duty, the sole duty of African scholars, according to some of these professors' conclusion. And they are saying that because, again, there is this contention by Professor Philip Cotton that if we are going to have a field of African history majorly occupied or dominated by African scholars, that will necessarily lead to the ghettoization of African history. And they are saying that the duty of rebuilding African history, rebuilding African studies is solely the duty of African scholars. So, Prof, with regards to the intervention of Professor Dike, how relevant is that to this material point in time we are living in?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And there's a question from Dr. Albert Onabayedo. So I think for interest of time, I'll just read it from the chat because we have a number of other hands, and asks, history education was deeply undermined at every level of the school system in Nigeria since the 1990s. It was literally yanked off primary and secondary schools curricula until recent times. Admission into BA history programs plummeted as the number of applicants thinned out. The Department of History, Ibadan, was perhaps the only one that kept an untainted BA history program. How did Ibadan School of History deal with this? He asks, is it now Uru? There's a question next in line, I believe, is Dr. Nfam. I don't know if you're able to unmute. Dr. Odega Teresa Nfam. Yes,
thank you very much. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much, sir. I want to appreciate our prof for that brilliant lecture. Thank you so much, Prof.
Thank you.
Prof, the issue of historians coming together to enable us put our heads together to contribute to the downfall of what is going in Nigeria today. Prof, sir, I hardly see you in Historical Society of Nigerian conferences. I've discussed with you in Ibadan once that we met in Tony Falola's conference.
Yes.
We hardly see you around. We want people like you to come so that you can contribute your quota. For instance, the conference is coming up in October. I would like to see you around. We historians need to meet to see how we can salvage our country, Nigeria. What is happening in Nigeria today is as a result of not looking at the past, where we are coming from. History is all about the past, the present, to enable us move to the future. If we historians are not there to contribute, Nigeria is going to nowhere. Today, we talk about the past, how Nigeria was good in the past. When you look at the past, most of the key positions were handled by Nigeria, by historians. They were handled by historians because they look at what happened, why did we achieve so much in the past? And now, why are we falling? So my question is, can't you particular Prof, come and let us reason together to see how we can salvage Nigeria? You know, we are always talking of Ibadan School, talking of this, talking of that, but we don't come together. I want us to come together by this coming Historical Society of Nigerian Conference. I beg of you, some of you who don't come, please come. I want us to salvage. I want to join you as a professor to salvage this country. Otherwise, what we are seeing now, we have just started. Nigeria is falling, is crumbling. I'm weeping as I'm talking to you. Nigeria is crumbling. So I want us to come together. Let's put our heads together to move the country forward. We are talking of our departments, much impact. We are creating impact in our departments, but our country is falling. How do we move Nigeria forward? Thank you, Prof. I appreciate you so much. God bless you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And we have Hakeem Tijani and then Mubarak Tukur. And that is the list of questions that I have, unless others have a last minute question they would like to get in. I don't know if Priscilla Simere would like to ask a question. She's writing on history of education. as well, but please,
Okay.
Hakeem Tijani, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. First of all, let me commend Professor Olutayo Adesina for holding forth at the Ibadan School of History and for this presentation. My apologies for missing greater part of it, but as a student of history, notwithstanding the rank professorial, when we stop to learn, we become foolish. I have listened to the comments from 3 colleagues, notwithstanding whether they are former students, they are my colleagues, okay? And I cannot but speak when the last speaker spoke. You see, the weeping, in my opinion, should first and foremost start with the clique in HSN at the moment. You have to weep, you have to pray for them. And what do I mean? We have to decolonize the minds of those at the end of affairs since, I would say, the exit of Oshefu. I served as a vice president for Southwest HSN. I slept in mosquito-infested brotels or motels in order to rewrite, to get history back into the public schools. We finished. Today, when you read about what has been published, it's about self-glorifying clique of people, and you can quote me anywhere, okay? Adesina has given his own contribution. Tijani has given. I do not see anyone within the current, and starting from Ogbogbo, none of them is here. I checked through the 90-something when I joined. They are not here. So the weeping and crying when it comes to Nigeria must start from that end. The idea of prebendalism is totally objectionable in my own 34 years in the system. One of our teachers is here, Professor Adebayo Akomo. The prebendal nature, particularly with the Nigerian historian, is so appalling. How can you write those primary GSS 1 to 3 and 3 to 6, whatever, that we use pencil with NERDC? I still have those pictures to develop the curriculum, and then you forget, your memory is so short, then you forget those who served diligently. You forget somebody like Ambassador Igali, who behind the scene, apart from being the pioneer student of Professor Alagua at Uniport, the first set of history students at Uniport, who had risen, that assisted us. No mention. And when I post on your so-called HSN, it's always, problematic for those who refuse to. So you must decolonize their minds. You must stop this prebendal politics going on. All I hear is First Street here, First Street there. It's just madness, so to be frank with all of you. Let me end it up by also challenging the Ibadan School of History. The first local, I may be corrected, PhDs, 3 of them in 1963. The first 3, I believe the warrant chiefs, I call him warrant chief, and he's dead now. Professor Afibu was one of them. Maybe the third, Morelas, I can't remember who was in between. Between 64 or 63, 64, when Afibu got his PhD, until his death, tell me how many PhD did he produce? None. And then you have somebody calling me in 2009 to contribute to a so-called festry. And I ignore it. After a month, he called and said, sir, how many children does he have? The man was still living. He said, what is my children? So please, let me just, I'm taking, you see, it is 5 hours. I've been so busy and I'm sorry for coming in late, but you have to understand that I'm also in the, I'm not in Nigeria. Yeah. I'm not within Africa. So you have to bear with some of us that have to wake up and join some of these things.
Thank you.
So I will round up now. So how many has he, between that period, if you don't reproduce, it is part of the decolonization we're talking about. So why should I celebrate you? Why should somebody running up and down? And you celebrating and you running up and down, all of you in HSN. But this presentation is not about Nigeria. Thank God Nigeria has a population. And that is why we always go back. Makerere was one of the first in a decolonized British entanglement. And I appreciate them for bringing this up and talking about this. But first and foremost, we have to go back into our backyard and reflect. That is the truth. And I can go on a round table with anybody. For some of you representing them to come on board and we discuss frantically. It is factual. Some of us give us dollars to come to Nigeria for 8 years and receive your naira. All the same, they started talking. It becomes personal, some of these things. And until we get personal, we will not correct and decolonize the minds that are being corrupted, particularly of the Gen Z generation. Thank you very much, and God bless you.
Thank you, sir.
God bless Makerere for organizing this. My apologies to my teacher, Professor Adebayo, if I've gone overboard. That is just me. I just have to talk. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir. We have 2 more questions. There's a Mubarak Tukur. I don't know if Mubarak, if you're able to unmute and ask your question quickly. Hello. Maybe while we wait, there's a question from
Thank you for the opportunity given to me.
Yes, please go ahead.
For me, mine is just simple. I want Prof to maybe if there's a link between the Ibadan School of History and the ABU School of History. For example, he talked about Abdullah Smith, which we all know that Abdullah Smith is the one who established the ABU School of History, producing people like Saad Abakar and Yusuf Bala Osman. So does that mean that Ibadan School of History have an impact in the formation of like Ipe School of History, University of Lagos? So as we have from the northern part, we have from ABU, we have the emergence of like Bayero University School of History and Osman Danfodio University School of History. So I want to have a kind of, is there any connection with this, these two kind of great School of History and the point of departure between the two of them? Where you see that maybe the issue of Marxism was there, maybe during the time of late Bala Osman. So there was a kind of serious discourse, intellectual discourse between Bala Osman and the late Kenneth Dickey. So I wish if Prof can say more on that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we're giving you far too many questions than you can answer in a short period. There's
one hand up.
There's one hand up, and there's another question from Priscilla Asimire about the how did university adult education and the Department of History collaborate in any way? In other, what were there connections between, say, continuing education and the Department of History throughout this period? If I think it's a question about our was the Department of History's influence moving beyond the department into other fields in the university, not just the other disciplines. we now have two more hands. I think this will be it. If you could, if you could ask your questions very briefly, and then we'll allow Professor Adesina to respond. First, Professor Odebunmi, sorry. Please go ahead.
Okay. Well, it's a very short question I put on the chat box earlier on. Now, I just want to know the ideologies that drove the Ibadan School of History when it started, and whether or not that ideology is sustained in the current time. Thank you. It's a very short question. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I see, I don't see a name, but I see there's one more hand raised. So I don't know who, if you have your hand raised, please go ahead, but I can't see your name.
All right, my name is Ubon.
My name is Delela Iwola.
Yes, sir. Welcome, sir.
I've been there all along.
Go ahead, sir.
I was going to ask, thank you for the beautiful lecture you gave. And I was going to say that at the beginning of the lecture, I saw that you made this relationship between the founding of history, African history, for the indigenization of scholarship, just for the same reason for which African studies was founded. And the same Kenneth Dike, who was the prime mover in history department, was also the pioneer director of African studies at Ibadan. And you know, the Institute of African Studies at Ibadan was the first Institute of African Studies on the continent. Now, just for the same purpose of the indigenization of scholarship. And you know, at some point, including Professor Ade Ajayi, it was said that, was there any reason for the study of African studies in an African university? Thank God that that did not happen for the study of oral history and African history, that nobody queried it. And of course, it would have been preposterous to query that Africans should study their own history, which is a sine qua non, I mean, for citizenship as well as for statehood. Now, I'm grateful that you mentioned it, that this point was for the indigenization of scholarship, which was necessary, and for decoloniality also. And I also remember that Peter Eke, you mentioned that Ade Ajayi said that this was an episode. The intervention of colonial history was an episode in African history, and colonialism was an episode in African history. But Peter Eke says that it is an epoch. Now, I would like you to just compare the two views. It's not largely different, but I like the angle which you are taking to it, and I will just like you to shed a little more light on the fact that indigenization of scholarship in history is the same point for the indigenization of scholarship in African studies. Thank you very much for your contribution. I enjoyed every bit of the lecture. Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we're going to have to draw the questions to a close and allow you to answer what questions you can and draw a conclusion to this really fascinating discussion.
Thank you very much, sir. Let me start with Professor Delela Iwola and the question of African studies in an African university. In the Department of History, apart from African history, we are also engaged in teaching other courses, other subjects. So the extent and reach that the African studies can go, we might not be able to go that far because the African studies is a specialized unit. And so whatever they were doing there, and they are still doing there, is still an adjunct to the Department of history. So we are all together, there is no difference. And whether episodic or an epoch, as AK has said, for me, it's pure semantics. And let's just accept what Ade Ajayi has said, that whether it's an episode or an epoch, there is no way you can even talk about colonial history without talking about African history. It's that simple. So for you to understand how colonialism worked, then you must understand African history. That's very significant, and that's what Ade Ajayi was trying to say. So yes, the intellectual argument was wonderful, but it doesn't need to delay us, because we recognize the fact that there was an ideology. I mean, using that to go to Professor Debumi's question, there was an ideology that drove the Ibadan School of History, which was the African ideology. And as I said, it was the position of DK that Africans must not only instinctively have faith in their own inheritance, which talks so much about the African ideology, but must also satisfy themselves by scientific inquiry that it exists. So it's different from neoliberal thought, it's different from Marxist thought. It's an African thought, implicit belief in yourself, in your values, in your orientation, in your philosophies, in everything. And that was the ideology that drove the Ibadan School. Priscilla, continuing education and Department of History. Yes, of course, history was a very, very important subject. And with the department, especially at Ibadan, took part in the training and retraining of people through continuing education. There is no way you can talk about continuing education today and you won't talk about Professor Michael Omolewa, who was our contribution to that continuing education. It's very significant. So we took part greatly in that. Then Mubarak, a link between Ibadan and Abu. Yes, of course, the Ibadan spirit created the Abu spirit. And the Abu spirit also had to do a kind of ethnography that ultimately helped in the understanding and creation of Islamic knowledge, Islamic historiography, and it's a carryover from the Ibadan approach. Never mind the fact that while we were doing the superstructure, Abu was doing the substructure, but it's all in the services of Africa. So yes, many of those who graduated from Abu and went on to teach elsewhere have served as external examiners at Ibadan. Recently, Professor Gwadabi came to examine the last PhD candidate before we went on strike. So this relationship has continued in very significant ways. So there is no way you can break, even though there are boundaries, but there is no way you can separate what we are doing. It's same goal, different approaches. And it's about the edification of African history. Well, Professor Akim Tijani, yes, you are right. And I've talked a little bit about this when I was talking about the university management in Africa. We must begin to help them to decolonize their minds. As historians, we have to continue to talk, to point them in the direction of what should be done. Part of what is happening even nationally is that those in government, we have not been able to decolonize their minds. And historians have a lot of work to do in this regard. Thank you very much for pointing out that out. So in the conclusion to my book, I will dwell significantly on what you have pointed out. Well, Dr. Odeiga, thank you for your advocacy and your admonitions. I can assure you that my spirit is always with the Historical Society of Nigeria. In different ways, I have also contributed to what they are doing, but out of sight is not out of mind. I can assure you. Thank you very much. Well, Dr. Albert, history education was undermined, yes. Admissions plummeted elsewhere, yes. BA history in Ibadan also suffered from that. We began to experience hard times in Ibadan from the 1990s with the effect of the structural adjustment program. And so around 1995-96, because we were no longer getting people who read history from secondary school, we also had to change the admission criteria for coming to study history. So for the first time around 1996, we began to take people who read government rather than history to come and study history. And of course, it was obvious that, of course, you have to go back to the basics in teaching them history. And that has continued for a long time. But now that history is back on the curriculum, we are hoping that we are going to begin to get a surfeit of those who are interested in history, who have a knowledge of history, who have an interest in history, who have a passion for history, and they will begin to come in again. So, but we have continued to maintain our BA history because when you actually study history very well, linking this with Professor Emiraji's position, embedded in the accretions that you begin to see, embedded in the history curriculum are those things that you call international studies, international relations, diplomatic studies. We teach all these things together. When you also talk about business administration, we might not be history and business administration, but when we teach the history of the trans-Saharan trade, we also bring out the significance of trade, of business, of currency, of everything. So it's already embedded. For those of our students who are interested in the history and international studies, we have adequate departments of international history and international studies all over the country. Yes, they can go there. If you are really interested in pure history, that gives you the undiluted form of knowledge that allows you to look at the past, that allows you to critique the present, and that allows you to project into the future, come to the real and authentic Department of History. That's why we have not changed our curriculum. We have enough. And then, of course, we are, even as Department of History, we are already oversubscribed. We're oversubscribed because people are beginning to see that, well, it's a highfalutin. History and diplomatic studies, history and strategic studies, but even those ones, what they have continued to do is to continue to lay emphasis on history. The peculiar nature of the country now is why they have changed their names and exactly why some of our colleagues are being overworked. You have to justify the population in your department. You have to get, people to tell the administration that you are viable and vibrant. That's not the way to go about it. And so we have continued to remain as the Department of History. We are oversubscribed, and I don't see us changing the nomenclature of the department. Even many of our students go outside, and when they ask them what you study in UI, they said history and diplomatic studies. I kept on telling people who met me to say, no, we don't have a course like that. History is history. Well, Temitope Faguma, thank you for your thoughts on the role of the academia and its struggle with neoliberalism. It's a serious battle with neoliberalism, and Department of History is one of the victims, and that's why we are suffering from the effect of the structural adjustment up till now. But I can assure you that it's not the sole duty of the African scholar to actually, I've shown you with the Ibadan School of History approach that it's not only because you are an African, you are the only people who can teach African history. No, that's not tenable. I think there was a debate in the 1990s about ghettoizing African studies. No, we don't subscribe to that, and it's not going to help our cause at all. We have to bring in more people to support our cause. Well, Abdullah Arubnadi, the web presence of HSN, I cannot speak to that. I will pass on your question to the HSN High Command, and I'm sure they will do something about it. And of course, history having a utilitarian value. Yeah, we have also changed the orientation of our pedagogy to emphasize this. And in recent times, we have also reviewed our curriculum. New courses are on board now. In the last 2-3 years, we have brought on board 3 new courses. And apart from that, we are also working on new programs in history that will bring in diversity to the field. Well, I suppose, Edgar was talking about the assault on humanities. Yes, there is an attempt to continue to frame us within the context of social sciences, curriculum, and language. And that is why the African Humanities Program came on board to support African scholars in the humanities to say, no, remain true to your liberal arts philosophy. And they have helped us for over 10 years to do that. So the hegemony of the social sciences, the imperialism of the social sciences has been rolled back significantly. Professor Emiraji, the appendage, we don't want to become history and something. We still have our Department of History. It is still viable, and we still believe that we are still capable of contributing to the frontiers of knowledge the way we are. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this really wonderful discussion. And I apologize, there are still comments coming in the chat. We're unfortunately over 45 minutes over our allotted time. But all I can say is that I hope and I know that this is not the end of these conversations. And I hope that there will be opportunities, that we can create more opportunities for discussion between Makerere and Ibadan about the debates around our fields over time. And I think this has been extremely helpful for many of us who are thinking about similar issues in other contexts as well. So I would like to I think we should all give a virtual or real round of applause for our speaker, Professor Adesina, and our discussant, Dr. Pamela Kanakwa. This has been really a wonderful discussion, and I thank everyone for attending. Just for those who are interested, the department does have a YouTube channel where some of our seminars are posted online. I'm just putting the link in the chat for those who are interested. We will be, on the 23rd to the 26th of August, Makerere is having a international conference. It's a hybrid conference, so I believe it will be possible to attend online as well for those who are interested. I can share the links with those who are on my, our mailing list, and if you're interested, you can get in touch with them for the details. And we will be back with a seminar starting in the first week of September. So please watch for those announcements as well. Just thank you again to everyone for attending and this really wonderful discussion.
Thank you.
And yes.